And so we've been speaking about this image and this metaphor of the vessel, of that sensitive field of containment in which the alchemical work can unfold, and in the psychotherapy world, as I've mentioned, we have that analogous idea of the adequate, empathically attuned holding environment, which comes from Winnicott. And there's just something about this word holding and the feeling that it evokes. It's archetypal, meaning we're wired to hold and to be held, not only physically, of course, but to have our psychic, emotional, and spiritual experience held as well, for it to be witnessed and companioned, where we're provided the space and the permission to be who and what we are, and to have our basic goodness reflected back to us. A safe environment, a holding environment in which we can come into being. And the psychological term for this that we hear sometimes is mirroring. And in those moments, when we're held by another person or an inner soul figure or by nature or by a god or a goddess, by the ally, by the moon or the ocean, our nervous systems very naturally settle and downregulate. Our minds soften, our hearts open, and we come into a deep sense of rest. A kind of rest that I think so many of us have been longing for since beginningless time, perhaps. A rest that has somehow seemed just out of reach, just not possible. It's like a rest from becoming, from having to become someone different, something different, someone more intelligent, more attractive, more creative, less clingy, more worthy of love, or if we're really spiritual, someone more healed, more awakened, more enlightened. It's that project, that unending project of becoming. And it's from the ground of this primordial sort of rest, I think, that we're able to really play again in reality, to dance in the full spectrum, to feel more, not less, and to explore in those more unstructured states of consciousness, such as awe, wonder, spontaneity, creativity, intimacy, and really the simple joy of just being itself. And part of this journey of the soul alchemist really involves our capacity to participate in this holding environment in a sensitive and attuned vessel. And as a young child, of course, as an infant, as a little one, this holding, to the degree it emerged at all, which for many of us, it just didn't, but it came from our early attachment figures. We didn't have the capacity to sort of craft this sort of inner temple of holding on our own. It occurs in relationship. But here we are now, some decades later, and whether or not we had access to this sort of attuned sensitivity at an earlier time in our lives, it is something which is emerging. And it's an aspect of what we already are in our deepest nature. What we are is that holding environment. And we can discover that holding in our own experience with a friend or a lover or a therapist or a mentor. We can reach out to the guides and the allies of the soul world, the natural world, and we can come to discover that perhaps the ultimate holding environment is our own essential nature, that of open, compassionate presence. And so in a moment of activation, when we're triggered, when we're hooked into that reactivity, when we start to fall apart, when one of our core wounds or sensitivities is touched and awakened, when we're not seen in the way that we want to be seen, when we feel unfairly judged or criticized, or we become caught up in a spiral of shame or disappointment, or scared or hurt. It can be as if we're under a waterfall of intrusive, habitual, critical thinking, flooded with difficult emotions and all sorts of dysregulated bodily arousal. We're starting to fall down the rabbit hole. It's hot, sticky, gluey, gooey, claustrophobic, like the walls are caving in. Do you know this feeling? But in these moments, the automatic sort of knee-jerk response is to get out of that embodied vulnerability as quickly as possible. And we each have our go-to familiar strategies to do this, which of course are necessary at times. No shame, no blame, no judgment around that. Sometimes we just have to take care of ourselves in this way, to leave the vessel. But from the perspective of the alchemy of the soul, we might start to see that these protective strategies, in large part, are a manifestation of a certain sort of self-abandonment. And yes, while these strategies were intelligent and adaptive, the best ways we knew to take care of ourselves at an earlier time. I think the question now for many of us is, to what degree do I still need that sort of protection? Or is it possible that I have accesses to resources now that simply weren't available earlier in my life? Perhaps I don't need to bail out of my body, to get tangled up in that looping of that spiral of shame, blame, self-aggression, that I can start to experiment with re-encoding these ancient circuitries of fight, flight, freeze, of repressing what I'm experiencing, or on the other hand, having to unconsciously act it out. That in a moment of recognition that I've been thrown off center, it all starts in that moment of recognition of a certain pause, that I've been hooked into some emotional reactivity. I can feel that shutting down, that anxious, restless claustrophobia, or whatever those early signs are for us. But in the recognition of this, the choice, the possibility of interrupting that momentum that has built up over years, over decades, over generations, to turn away and to slow down, to pause, to take a few deep breaths, to feel my feet on the floor, to lay a hand on my belly or my heart and just renew my commitment in that moment, my devotion, my intention to stay close, to make embodied, compassionate contact with what it is that's arising in my experience, that's wanting or needing to be felt, to be held, to be metabolized, at the level of intention first, really, to take care of myself in a new way.